Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here at this channel where we talk about all things related to education, and my goal is to get people thinking about what we're learning and about what we're teaching, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. It really helps get information out to more parents and educators and others concerned with education in America. And also consider sharing this broadcast, liking this broadcast. And if you have comments or questions during the broadcast, we are live, so feel free to drop them into the comment section. Today, I'm very fortunate to have as my guest Stephanie Nguyen. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I've asked her to come and speak with us today because she is in the mental health profession. She hosts a podcast, You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. It's available on YouTube and all streaming platforms. She also writes and has a small private practice in Portland, Oregon. You can find her at sometherapist.com or on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. So we're going to discuss these current trends in education from a psychological and mental health perspective. We're going to consider the question and the title. Are we possibly treating normal childhood and adolescence as some kind of, pathology or disorder? And what's her take? So what I'm going to do is mention things one at a time that I'm seeing in education and then have Stephanie respond as to what she thinks about it. So I'll start right away with the current trend to screen all students in a school for mental health issues. So offering some kind of standardized screening where all the students in a class through, questions on a computer or whatever will be screened to see where they fall in terms of their depression, anxiety, and those sorts of things. What is your take on that?
Hmm. Where is this happening? Is this like a new universal, or have you heard about it in
It is part of the SEL, social emotional learning program that is really it's been in place in schools for decades, but the screening is newer. I would say this has been going on depending on your location from 2017 forward, but it really intensified in the last 2 years post COVID because there was a huge infusion of cash from the federal government and some very big tech companies funded in part by things like the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation and Bill Gates and so forth, where the data is being fed not just to the government but to these companies as well.
Wow, do you know what, assessment tools they're using or what these questions are?
hmm Yeah, I've profiled them on the channel. It's a really long inventory of questions that are things up until 13 years of age. The teachers are doing it for the students. So the teachers, or if it's a daycare situation, they're actually going as young as 18 months. They're doing 18 months to 36. They have a different assessment. And the adults are checking boxes like it's a scale of, sometimes, never, often, those kinds of little boxes. And it'll say in the past 4 weeks or in the past week, how many times have you seen the student do X or be X? And the questions can be things like seem happy, make eye contact, or be helpful to other people, seem excited about something, demonstrate curiosity, you know, like all kinds of subjective questions. I could probably go find one of the questionnaires if you wanted to see one, but they are very long. There'll be dozens and dozens of questions. And I would say 90% of them are, if not 100%, subjective to the person answering the questions. And it doesn't become a self-reporting tool until usually after 13 years of age.
Okay. Yeah, so this is concerning on a number of levels, right? One is that this is school, not therapy, and not home. Two is that this is, like you said, very subjective, and it sounds like it lacks validity. I mean, my first thought when you said that this is happening is, I wonder if they're using like the GAD-7, the generalized anxiety disorder scale number 7, right? With, at least some uh, measures that have some validity to them. Not that it would be appropriate for those scales to be administered by people who aren't mental health professionals, right? Because as mental health professionals, we know how to interpret those things in light of other factors.
Right.
I also feel concerned about the time scale. I mean, in the last 1 week, in the last 4 weeks, that's such a short period of time. And if this data is then being used to identify, oh, maybe this kid needs counseling, we need to pull them from class and take them to the school counselor just because they had a bad week or something like that. Um, I mean, I think that schools have some responsibility. Anyone who's in contact with children has some responsibility to just kind of verify that things are okay at home, right? Teachers are mandated reporters, just like I am as a therapist, just like doctors are. And so we need to be able to recognize signs of abuse or neglect. And there might
Sure.
be, certain questions that themselves wouldn't be too upsetting to the kids, but that just might kind of be able to assess whether there's some kind of extra support needed. But those would be questions, I mean, maybe at the beginning of the year, making sure that the kid has a pediatrician, right? Because if they
Right.
have a pediatrician, that's a sign that the parents are, maintaining their wellness and that the doctor is then going to be responsible. And then the pediatrician should have a certain level of responsibility for making sure everything's okay at home. But those are professional roles, and assigning it to teachers and making it this subjective, perceptions of happiness, things like that, it just makes me wonder what's the point,
Right.
and whether children feel like they're scrutinized or under a radar. I also think that kids look to adults for guidance as to whether something is a big deal or not. Like, is it a big deal that I am not happy today? It's like, no, it's not a big deal. You had a day, right? The kids didn't want to play basketball with you today, but you haven't been excluded and bullied for years and years. It's going to be okay. And that's what fosters resilience, and that's such an important part of kids learning to manage normal anxiety, is just for them to be able to look to us and get the sense that, nope, it's just a skinned knee. It's not the end of the world. I've been
Right.
thinking today in preparation for this episode about a couple of observations. Um, One I'll never forget from years ago was, I want to make sure I don't share anybody's personal information, but just a situation where I observed a couple bringing their baby into a room. The baby's maybe like 1 year old, that the baby had never been in before. And the baby was showing signs of fear, as you do when you're a baby in an unfamiliar environment. And the dad, probably thinking that he was being empathetic and emotionally intelligent as a parent, said, "Scary." Like he was mirroring the kid's feelings. And it's like, no, no, you're teaching the kid that this normal uncertainty that an infant or a baby experiences in a new environment is in fact an indicator that there's some kind of reason for concern there, when really your role as a parent is to give your child appropriate cues as to whether this environment is safe or not. And in this case, this is a perfectly safe environment.
Mhm.
Another story that's been coming to mind would be an example of a kid having intrusive thoughts of recognizing that they could be harmed, or that they could harm somebody. Uh, Recognizing that harm is possible and having scary thoughts about that isn't necessarily an indicator that harm is happening, or that the kid has anybody to be afraid of, or that they're actually wanting to harm themselves, right? There's a big difference between, oh my gosh, I could cut myself, and I really want to cut myself, right? Those are very different things. And some kids, let's say they're 8, 9, 10, they're having this thought for the first time in their life. It's never occurred to them before that they could be harmed or that they could do harm. And when we have a thought that's disturbing, um, there's a part of our mind, I like to call it playfully the disaster detector, that's like scanning your thoughts, that goes, ah, that's an alarming thought. And then it hones in on that thought and gives a lot of emphasis. And what a kid needs in a situation like that is just for the adults to say, oh, yeah, that's a scary thought. That is true. It's true. You have the potential that you could hurt someone if you got aggressive, but you wouldn't do that, would you? Right? Like, they just need us to say, it's just a thought. You are not your thoughts. And, I think there's so much emphasis on this like mental cleanliness and this obsession with fixating on our minds, that people are forgetting that you don't have to believe every thought you think. You can't always control what thoughts go in and out of your mind. I mean, we have thousands of them a day, but you can decide how you interpret them, how much energy and focus you give them, and which parts of yourself to feed.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I did want to add that some of these screenings they'll say are to detect, early detection, what they call early warning signs of, pathology of some kind of mental health problem. But they also claim the companies selling these products, it's mostly companies that are selling them to the school districts, that they can also uh, prevent academic failure, and they can detect whether the child has enough what they call protective factors. And so what they do then with these surveys is they group the children. It's not just an individual report. They group the children by who has protective factors, who doesn't, who needs what they call more, it's a more intervention, and they mean it in a classroom sense. In other words, they don't mean it in, a clinical sense. And they're talking about things like they're using terms. These are the terms that they use that they're looking for: self-awareness, self-management, goal-directed behavior, social awareness, relationship skills, personal responsibility, decision making, and optimistic thinking. Now, all of those sound pretty good, right? As a parent, you're like, yeah, I want my kid to have all those things. The devil is in the details, because when you read their definitions of things like relationship skills, a child's consistent performance of socially acceptable actions that promote and maintain positive connections with others. Now, I can get with maybe half of that definition, okay? And there are others, like even social awareness. There's they mention impact on others, which to me feel, a student could interpret that as, oh, now I have to anticipate what all my impacts are going to be, and you can't possibly do that. And personal responsibility is focused on group. So this is the last one I'll tell you: a child's tendency to be careful and reliable in his or her actions in contributing to group efforts. That's in personal responsibility, not social. And so you take terms that seem like we all understand what they mean, but when you add their definitions, it starts to paint a picture of, we consider the appropriate way to act, or the appropriate way to feel and think and be, is group directed, externally focused, and so on. Okay. There seems to be a, like an agenda, for lack of a better word. And when they then say we're going to group the children, it's hard for someone like me who analyzes this stuff not to wonder, are they going to project things into the children? Are they going to identify things as pathologies that are just a normal, different, introverted person, a person who's shy? Are we going to pathologize shyness because the person doesn't want to make those kinds of connections all the time? And so I would ask you, does this kind of a thing concern you when they say we can head off academic failure this way? We can head off mental health problems by grouping the kids and labeling the kids like this, that they'll say they're strong. They call it strong, typical, or like needs work.
It sounds really scrutinizing, and it makes me wonder, why is this necessary in comparison to what any decent adult, the kind of adult that goes into being a teacher, especially, right? Generally, teachers have big hearts for children. Um, why is that? Why is it not good enough that when an adult is properly resourced and not overwhelmed by, let's say, a large class size, that it's our natural tendency to observe kids and see who needs extra support in the social skills department, right? And that doesn't have to come in some structured form. It can just come through, you're seeing kids on the playground and you decide that now's a moment to say, "Hey, I think he'd really like the ball. Will you pass the ball to him?" Right? Those little moments that just happen organically when we're actually focused and present with kids. And it just makes me wonder, who's making money off of selling this kind of curriculum or program? And wouldn't that money better be spent on reducing class sizes and paying teachers better and having the classrooms just be more resourced in general, because I think that when we're well resourced, we do those things naturally. And it's about the relationship, right? So much of helping kids grow just comes organically through relationships. There's no substitute for quality time, role models, and, just people being attentive with one another. And when I hear about how rushed the school schedule is and how overwhelmed teachers are, I think they're barking up the wrong tree with the stuff. These kids don't need to be assessed in schools by people who aren't really qualified to conduct those assessments. They don't need these special programs. They just need attention.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think when you talk about resourced, I think part of that would go into the training of the teachers. Not so they can be clinicians, but so that they can be trained to be observers. And I do think that is something you can learn to be better at. I will give my graduate program credit for one thing. We were required for the entire year that we were student teaching, because we student taught for a year, to keep a detailed journal of our observations. And we had to have a detailed, sort of observation of every single one of our students, and we had to provide evidence. So, in other words, you couldn't just watch a kid and say, so and so did this. You had to put down what if you had a concern, why you had a concern, what they did, what you did about it. Did it work? Did it not work? So, it was almost like you were conducting your own you weren't conducting research on them that was going to impact them negatively. That'd be unethical. It was more just observing them and then planning your teaching accordingly to try to remediate where you thought they needed help. But the goal was to have that become more organic, more automatic, that this is not maybe something that we're all naturally good at. And especially those of us who don't have our own children, I think parents have, or people who spend a lot of time around children, have a tendency to have had some practice at this. But even as a parent, I don't observe other people's children nearly as well or as intuitively, using all of my faculties as well as I do my own. But this really did help. And so things like that can be a resource.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of professional development, rather than we're going to teach you how to use this computerized system, which
Mm-hmm.
is what they spend a lot of time doing.
Yeah, and you talk about learning on your channel, and I think the way we learn as adults too, um, comes through observation and speculation and testing out hypotheses, right? One of my best teachers in my grad program in counseling had this very Socratic method of teaching. It was I took family therapy and child therapy with him. And I remember in our family therapy class, it was a small, intimate group. We'd have hours together, and he would present a case. He would say, okay, parents bring in their kid, and this is the presenting problem. What do you think is going on here? And we would muse and speculate and hypothesize. And it was getting our own gears going that really taught us those skills. And what I'm
Mhm.
hearing instead is that these things are very prescribed, right? It's like measure this, measure that, measure that. And if the score is this, then it means that. And that's not the same as observation and
Right.
thinking yourself. Another thought that's popping into mind is that, if we have time to hypothesize, then and if we're open to all possibilities rather than looking for, oh, this kid needs counseling or they're autistic or whatever, then, the reason that a kid looks like they're in a bad mood could be because they have a stomach ache, right? Like there's so many reasons that a kid could be presenting with indicators that they're not emotionally their best. And we don't need to jump to conclusions about what that means or what the solution is, or
Right.
whether a solution is needed.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Are we a solution in search of a problem to,
Mm.
fix so we can justify something? Um, what about boundaries? As a parent, picturing my child in this situation, I just feel like it's so intrusive.
Yeah, I agree. And childhood is a time to learn what boundaries are appropriate, right? And if the adults around you are modeling something so invasive, then that is, some people would say that that's maybe a form of grooming. I think about my own work experiences as an adult, and I had a work environment once where the boundaries were very poor and the personal relationships and the feelings between people were a lot more front and center than I personally felt comfortable with, and I felt like it made us inefficient. It really distracted us from what we were there to do, which was ironically child and family therapy because there was so much
Mhm.
coworker drama, and it just felt like you couldn't just mind your own business and have a personal life that was separate. Instead, it was like all your stuff had to be out and everybody's business. And I think that the workplace and the school environment they're not mental health treatment centers. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, understanding and accommodating to people under certain situations where they might need some time off or some accommodations. But I think we already have those structures in place. Like there are laws, for disability accommodations at work. There are laws like the Family Medical Leave Act where if you have, let's say, you're working at a job for a few years and then some acute trauma happens. Let's say you're in a shooting, right? And now you have acute stress disorder or PTSD, right? Your employer has to approve if you need to leave 2 hours early on Wednesday to see a therapist. Like that, those provisions are already in place. And I think most people would be happy having a relationship with their boss where they don't know everything about their personal life, but where they feel comfortable enough because those professional boundaries are in place that they have a positive, neutral relationship, that they could come to their boss and say, my kid's sick today, or I'm sorry, I have a migraine. Do you mind if I like do a little extra work on Saturday? I think most people would be comfortable with that, right? But when there's a sense that everything about me is transparent to everyone and everyone's business, it's a recipe for disaster when it comes to mental health because we already have several cognitive biases that don't work in our favor. So one of them is the spotlight bias, right? The spotlight bias is the perception that everyone can see everything about you, that you're like in a spotlight or under a microscope. This is a really common error that we make because we're just self-focused and we're our own worst critics and we think everyone can see our flaws. Um, it's part of therapy sometimes to just teach people, everyone thinks that, right? Like nobody's scrutinizing that thing about you because they're too busy thinking that you're scrutinizing this thing about them that you didn't even notice, right? People with social anxiety, people with depression tend to have quite a spotlight bias sometimes, and it only makes them more insecure and neurotic and self-focused rather than curious about the world around them. Um, so I can imagine that going to school where you're there to learn, um, and then having your psychological insides examined, or just normalizing that it's other people's business to know like what you ate for lunch and all of that, like it just kind of confirms this suspicion that all eyes are on me, and then kids have fear of their own thoughts. I've seen this in anxiety in kids. It's like it comes with guilt and shame, like, oh my God, I thought a bad thought. Or, heaven forbid, kids who see something on the internet that they're not supposed to see, and then they feel guilty about it for a long time. And it's like, no, you can relax. Nobody can see what you're thinking. There are some things that generally come across like through facial expressions, and if you come to school looking unkempt, people might worry. Um, but But your thoughts are your own private business. You can learn to manage them. Not everything you think is a problem. And it's not necessarily a problem if you're not happy all the time because it's life.
Yeah, that's something that I'm seeing missing in general from the rhetoric surrounding mental health and schools. Everything that's coming out of the Department of Education and even superintendents, emails and so forth is this very somber concern. And, the instant something happens somewhere else in the world, like the shooting in Buffalo, for example, or even in Texas, you'll see superintendents the very next day. We're going to have an assembly. We're going to have counselors in the office. We're going to do this. We're going to do that to assist the children in coping with this trauma. And so I wanted to ask you, since we're obviously not going in the direction of it's okay and, bad, there's something bad happening somewhere in the world every day, but it's not affecting you. You're safe. right
Mm.
now, and let's focus on what we're doing right now, instead of doing what most you would think is common sense. They're marinating
Yeah.
in this trauma. What concerns you about that from as a mental health professional?
Well, just hearing you say the word serious, I mean, childhood is not a time for everything to be serious. Isn't that part of I mean, this is all about protecting children, but I mean, protecting childhood means protecting a time in life that there aren't heavy consequences for everything. I remember I attended a training once where they talked about the learning zone and the performance zone. The learning zone is a sandbox where, the worst that can happen is sand ends up in someone's eye. But if it gets thrown out the sandbox, if things get dirty, messy, ultimately, who cares? You're learning, you're exploring. You need there to not be high stakes for experimenting and encountering failures or um, mistakes or anything like that, right? And the performance zone is ideally a place we get to after we've had adequate time in the learning zone. Once we've developed a sense of mastery and competence, then it's appropriate to be in higher stakes situations where it actually matters if you know what you're doing, right? Like I'm in the performance zone right now because I've had time to learn. I mean, therapy is not a great example because the consequences are high from the moment that you start working with people. But childhood is a time for play. That's what needs to be protected, is the sense that there's not big consequences to everything you do. There needs to be appropriate consequences. That's where it's important that things be lighthearted enough of the time that you can tell if something really is serious. So like for an
Mm.
example, I'm in the early stages of adjusting to being a step parent. I moved in with my partner and his two kids part-time not too long ago. And, I'm really fortunate. They're a great family. My partner just loves to make people laugh and smile. He loves to give his kids a really fun childhood, and they're great learners, just naturally curious kids. And so most of our interactions are pretty light and playful. And, I had my first experience of really needing to discipline them recently when there was something that they had let me just say they damaged in playing, and they didn't realize they had damaged it. But when I brought it up, when I showed them, "Hey, look, this was damaged by the way that you were playing," their first reaction was, "That was already like that." And to me, that was a problem because 'cause I'm like, "Oh, they're just lying to my face. That's not a precedent that's okay with me to set around here." So then I brought them together and I used my tone of voice and my body language and my facial expressions to get serious, not in a scolding way, but I was like, "Hey guys, when I brought this up to you, you lied to me. You said it was already like that. I know that's not true. And it really bothers me that you would lie to me." And kids are they learn so much non-verbally, right? And if I was playing like, "Hey guys, you lied to me about this," then they would just keep going in that spirit. But the important thing that helped with that being a learning moment is that things are usually fun, right? And so it's my appropriate use of seriousness to set a boundary. That's what's going to help them learn. And
Right.
my concern hearing what you're describing is that if everything's serious all the time, then kids don't know what's a big deal or not, and they don't know what boundaries and consequences they should actually really steer clear of. The line is lying to an adult about something that matters, or the line is talking to a stranger if your parents aren't around, or they need to know where those lines really are, and then those lines form the boundary, and as long as you stay within that boundary, you're safe, you can play, you can explore.
Right. Speaking of lies and talking to strangers, um, one of the other things I'm seeing is teachers, and it's now school policy, and in some cases, it's state board of education policy, that teachers are not only permitted but encouraged to transition a child, socially transition first, and then assist them, even if they're, underage, meaning under 18, to get medical transition without telling the parents and without a reason for not telling the parents other than, well, the child hasn't already told the parents. So, in other words, the presumption is If the child is not voluntarily told the parents, there's some deep and dark reason why not, and they're immediately told, I will keep your secret. We will. And then in some states like New Jersey, the teachers are, and the superintendents and already principals are instructed in how to use the computer system to set up a blind file. In other words, the student has a file the parents can see, and the student has a file under their other name that they use at school, and the parent may not be the wiser for months. And this will go on while the child is socially transitioned. And then in some cases, if they have a health facility or they have one nearby, then the child may already be given hormones and the parents will not know about it, depending on the state laws where they happen to be. And as I said, this is not in response to this is an abusive parent. We have documentation. There's a case file. We're talking about just a parent. It's a parent that the kid, have you told mom and dad? No, you haven't. In other cases, we've seen material produced in part by one of the unions in California to tell teachers how to open up GSAs, gay straight alliances, these kind of clubs, and how to help the students disguise it as something else from their parents. So we're basically teaching teachers how to teach kids how to lie and obfuscate and hide things from their parents, whether that was necessary or not. And so that, to me, that does two things. It projects to the child, your parents won't like this. Whether they would have, like, you don't know what the reaction would have been, right? It's like, this is something that's a secret between us. And then it's encouraging children to lie to their parents, which is sort of the rule number one that you really never want an adult to do. So
There are so many points there to pick apart, right? The most striking thing initially to me is the hubris of just assuming that you know best as a teacher, assuming that you know something the parents don't know and that you're a better adult in the kid's life and that that's why they're telling you this secret. There's the triangulation, right? Which, if you care about kids' mental health, you're not going to drive a wedge between them and their parents. You're going to encourage them to thrive within the environment that they've grown up in. There are a lot of assumptions being made. There's a projection of abuse, right? And I think a lot of this comes from the conflation of the trans rights movement with the gay rights movement, right? We know that the trans rights movement has latched on to the LGBT community, and that's not actually okay with a whole lot of actual sexual minorities, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who are not, their sexual orientation has nothing to do with rewriting how we as a society think about gender or crossing boundaries that have never been crossed before or becoming lifelong medical patients. Like, lesbian, gay, bisexual people just want to live their lives in peace and have their partners. And but we know that part of how the trans rights movement has gotten so far is by exploiting people's sympathy and concern for gay rights, right? So then there's this mentality of, well, homophobia is bad. We want to protect people from homophobia, and we'd be so sympathetic if a kid was gay and their parents were homophobic. And then that translates into this kind of false equivalency. Transphobia is bad, and it's so terrible if a kid has to live with transphobic parents, and we're just going to assume that that's what's going on. And then we're going to assume that the reason that the kid's telling me, the teacher, and not the parents is because the parents really are so bad, right? And so I think there's this projection of maybe some like unprocessed abuse that maybe the teacher themselves experienced or the therapist, whatever the environment might be here, where maybe you really did come from a horrible home, or maybe you've worked with other kids who came from a horrible home. And so then that gets projected onto this child, and you start looking for abuse where it's not there. It's tragic that this is happening even to parents who have worked hard to cultivate good relationships with their kids' teachers. And then there's the grooming. But actually, backing up a second, there are so many reasons that a kid could say this to a teacher and not to their parents. And, one of their reasons could be that the kid actually knows that their parents wouldn't support it, not because it's not because of some bigoted belief, but because their parents know them better than that, and their parents are there to protect them. There's obviously a lot of social incentive right now to being trans or non-binary or using different pronouns or whatever. I mean, it takes in some ways, it takes a really strong kid not to, because there's such a strong social incentive right now. There are peer groups where, half the class is using different pronouns. There are kids who are getting bullied for not. And so a lot of kids are socially transitioning at school and not at home. And what I hear from parents is that where the kid seems to really care about this the most is how they're being seen in front of their friends, which is no different from any other teenager parent dynamic that's ever existed. Mom, don't call me sweetie when you're dropping me, or like drop me off 2 blocks from school because I don't want my friends to see the car you drive. And it used to be, even a mere decade ago, it would be that the kid was embarrassed that their parent drove a beater of a car. And now it's like, because there's all this stuff about privilege and oppression.
Yeah.
I've heard of kids who don't want their friends to see that they come from money, that their parents drive a nice car. I mean, there's just so many things that anybody of any generation is well familiar with, of how at a certain age you don't want your parents to embarrass you by showing the rest of the world anything about who you are at home or who you were when you were younger, or anything infantilizing. It's the same thing going on with the pronouns. Kids who are actually like not too worried about name and pronouns at home, which isn't to say all the kids who are doing the pronoun thing are that way, but a lot of kids don't really have that big of a reaction at home. But it's when they're in contact with their peers or anyone affiliated with their school, that's when they're like, no, I have to, demonstrate that I'm one of the cool kids. I'm one of the they thems, right? And so of course it makes sense that a kid who's worried about this peer pressure is going to go to their teacher saying, I need to be called this at school, because the teacher is going to model this in front of the peers and they're going to get socially rewarded for it. And then you have the dynamics. There's, I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with libs of TikTok, where they expose some really disturbing videos of teachers with an obvious agenda. And these teachers who have their secret closets where the kids can change into a superhero by, putting on clothes that are usually for the opposite sex. These teachers with the cool hair and the cool this and the cool that, like, of course you want to be cool with those teachers. You want to get their special favor. You want to emulate them and be like them. So there's just so many reasons that a kid might want to socially transition at school, and the adults are involved aren't examining any of that. They're just going with this narrative that it must be because the parents are so horrible, and so our job is to protect the kids from their parents, when really it's not too different from, well, this is the other thing, is that kids naturally triangulate adults to see what they can get away with. Like if parents are divorced, and typically in almost any divorce, one parent is going to be more permissive than the other. It's, you rarely find parents who are equally permissive, right? And so, the kid might go ask the more permissive parent for something that they're going to say yes to and hide it from the less permissive parent. And you can't blame kids for that. It's just how they're figuring out how people work and how they can get what they want. And it's our responsibility as adults to be cohesive, for in cases of divorce, to try to get on the same page as much as possible about what the boundaries are for the kid's sake. And how is this really any different? A kid going to one adult saying, I know that you'll give me this thing I want, so let's hide it from the other adult who won't give me what I want.
Right. And the thing
people
might be
overestimate the maturity of these kids.
social currency is really powerful. And now we've got it. The places you can spend your social currency have multiplied times, thousands, be it with social media and online gaming and Discord and all these different things. It used to be like you could go to school, or you could go to your extracurricular activity or your church or some other club or whatever, and that might be where you would sort of spend your social capital or need it. And at home, you wouldn't. Now they're on tech all day. They're on it at school. They're on it at home. They're on in the car ride on the way home. If they're not playing an organized sport or doing something organized in the afternoon, which is increasingly large numbers of kids, they're probably feeling like they're under that same microscope, that spotlight that you described, um, most of their waking hours. So the incentive for them to do all these things or to seek that kind of approbation is greater than we adults had when we were kids. Certainly somebody my age. And I think teachers who don't acknowledge that and respect it, right? And say like, this is operating here. I have to be mindful of this before I go, feeding this. It's concerning to me. Another thing I wanted to ask you kind of
Before we go on,
oh, yes, go
actually,
ahead. Sorry.
can I take a 2-minute break? I know we're live,
No, that's
um,
yeah,
but I'm
absolutely.
sure you have 2 minutes worth of stuff to share with your audience while I
Sh-
disappear for a sec.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
No
thanks.
problem. I
Be
will
right
see
back.
if anyone has questions when you come back in. Just let me know and I'll pull you back in. Okay.
Perfect.
So, guys, so far, what do you think? I mean, we've been talking on this channel about these issues. I've been talking about them, and obviously, I'm not a professional, I'm not a clinician, but I've voiced my concerns. It's one of the reasons I asked Stephanie to come in because I said, I'm not a professional. And so I'm spouting off about these things with my best guess. And yeah, right. And my thoughts as a mom, my thoughts as a former teacher, um, just human being, right? I don't think you need to be either of those things to be concerned about some of this, but I did want to gut check with somebody who, first of all, isn't in education. So some of the things that we're talking about today, she's hearing about, believe it or not, for the first time. So remember, there are a lot of people out there like that. So if you watch my channel or you watch other channels like mine, or you are subscribed to Substacks or follow people on Twitter, or you're a parent yourself paying close attention to these things, we still have to remember we're still in the minority. Most people don't know this stuff is going on. They don't know about the SEL screenings. They don't know that this stuff is happening. They've kind of heard buzz about the social contagion and the social transitioning and so forth. But remember, the mainstream narrative is that's not happening. That's not real, or it's overblown or whatever. Obviously, I've shown you many times in the channel it's not. It is happening. It is not overblown. But so from her perspective, I'm asking her these things. She's like, really? Okay. So some of it is it's just coming right out. So there's been no preparation for this.
All right, I'm back. What did I miss?
I just was telling them that one of the reasons that I asked you to come and that I'm really enjoying this conversation is that you're not involved in education. You're not a teacher. You're not a parent with kids in the school that are, you have your stepkids, but it's like a little new there too. And so to a certain extent, the things that I'm sharing with you, you're hearing, if not for the first time, you're hearing them in detail. You're
Mhm.
getting the sense of how widespread this is or what the specific questions are. You may have like seen it on Twitter, but it's not really your area of focus on the day to day. And so what you're giving us in terms of answers are your raw and true answer. Like, okay, well, if that's what's happening, then this is my reaction, right?
Mhm.
Which is something I think new for my audience. So I really appreciate it. And I would imagine they do too. So but what I was going to say, since we were on the topic of different reasons that kids would, with the triangulation and so forth, um, I come back to that projection. You mentioned projection of abuse. I also think the power of suggestion is really powerful with
Yeah.
students. So whether they're seeing a written question, and it's not just in these surveys, what I'm noticing is even in the academic subjects, let's say they read a novel, the questions they're asked to talk about or write about with regard to the novels, most of which at this point is struggle literature too. They're doing a lot of dystopian
Mm.
stuff and a lot of struggle literature, meaning, written very, very recently about somebody's struggle against, oppression. And the questions are asked about their feelings, their feelings. So
Mhm.
they're not asking the student necessarily to look at the characters or to have that nice emotional distance. That when we were
Mhm.
students, we would read literature and we'd be able to talk about what is the character thinking or how do you know?
Mm.
They're putting themselves into every story, into every narrative. And I, again, I'm a layperson, but I feel like that encourages a kind of for lack of a better word, narcissism. And it's not, I don't mean NPD. I mean just
Mhm.
everything's about me.
Self-focus.
Right.
Yeah.
And not in a good way. And I was just
Yeah.
wondering what you think about that.
I agree, about the power of suggestion. Even adults in grad school, we talk about med student syndrome or grad student syndrome. I remember, as a full grown adult in graduate school, my training in psychopathology, where we actually go through the DSM, we were warned, hey, you're going to think you have every diagnosis. You're going to read these and be like, oh, is that me? And so if an adult can read about symptoms and be like, "Oh, I do kinda get that way sometimes. Maybe I have this disorder." I mean, if an adult can be that way, how much more can a kid be that way? Like, "Oh,
Right.
maybe I do think or feel that way."
Right.
I also hear that, it's sort of taking away from the development of a healthy theory of mind, right? I think right now there's a lot of emphasis on some kind of, um perversion of empathy and compassion. It's very feelings based, right? And it's like you're supposed to feel a certain way about
Mhm.
things. And the way you're supposed to feel also depends on, your demographics. Like, if you're a quote unquote privileged demographic, then you're
Right.
supposed to feel remorseful for something you didn't do. And if you're an oppressed demographic, then you're supposed to feel righteously angry and sullen. I mean, whereas, we know that reading literature, fiction is actually good for helping us develop theory of mind. I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on cognitive understanding of other people because for all of the emphasis on empathy and compassion, I think we have very little. I think that I don't see people who are focused on this really developing a strong sense of understanding of how people can think differently for themselves. For me, it was really helpful to read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt because he helps people understand how those with different political and religious views aren't, they're not either stupid, crazy, or bigoted or evil, right? It's understanding the moral palette and how in a different cultural context or life circumstance a person could come to have values that aren't necessarily altogether different from yours, but they see they see those values manifesting in a different way, or they have a different conclusions that they've drawn based on their values, or they have a different values hierarchy. I think it's really important to do that work, and that's what fosters peace. That's what fosters growth. Is more tolerance and understanding of those who think differently from ourselves, and cultivating a good theory of mind can help you do that, right? Cultivating the ability to see things from different perspectives, including, yeah, analyzing a novel and, why did this character do that? That was a strange choice, but can I think about the world as she was experiencing it and how that made sense in that situation? And instead of that, there's this kind of emotional collusion of the overemphasis on empathy, but that doesn't actually lead to much cognitive development. And I do think that it's healthy for problem solving for us to not get caught up in feelings all the time. It doesn't mean that we're heartless, right? It's you have to have a degree of detachment, like you're saying, to really be able to stay grounded and offer support if someone's going through something.
Right.
It's
Right.
not helpful to get angry on other people's behalf most of the time.
And that seems to be a request, like a straight up request in many classrooms that they do. There's a lot of focus on activism specifically. And in many cases, the students are asked to be civically minded or politically active about issues that do not touch their lives at all. And either they're told they do touch their lives when in fact they really don't, and or they don't anymore. So in other words, there you may have heard people talk about how nothing has improved since the civil rights movement. And so then you'll take, a community of students in, let's say, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where it's a very, well-to-do community. And even if they have students coming from Camden, which is not as well off. Okay, Black students from Camden. Even Camden has improved dramatically since the civil rights movement. Okay, first of all, the kids are going to the Cherry Hill schools, which is certainly something they weren't doing before, 1964. And it's like nothing happened. Like time stood still, and they're told, you should be righteously angry about this thing that happened to other people long ago, as if it's happening right now. So there's this that's like they're bending time and space and depriving the kids of perspective, or what you're describing as I think you use different words, but I tend to use the word perspective, which is just, a sense of understanding, cognitive understanding for where other people are coming from or may have been coming from, the sort of circumstances of their lives that may not be like yours. And they're actually being instructed to get involved and be agents of change. And so the question baked in all of that is that healthy, first of all? And if it's not, how is it not? What things could be happening mentally, in terms of mental health, to the child who's asked to do that?
Okay. My first thought I just have to say is, who never says that things haven't changed since the civil rights movement? Black people who lived through the civil rights movement.
Isn't that interesting? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Like every older Black person I've talked to or heard from would not say that, right? Like,
Right. Exactly.
it's anyway. So gratitude is an important component of mental health, right? And you will hear this from new age people, you will hear this from people with a certain approach to mental health, but anyone remotely touching any of this stuff forgets about that, right? Instead, there's this hubris and there's this taking for granted everything that we have, which we actually have a pretty safe and pleasant world where we've solved a lot of problems thanks to the ingenuity, compassion, and hard work of a lot of people who've come before, right? And what's disturbing about this is that it entitles this, I will say, narcissistic rage and a really short-sighted perspective that, well, if nothing has changed, then does that mean that people didn't work hard enough, that they weren't smart, that we don't know anything about how to organize or make changes, that people aren't fundamentally desiring to be good to each other? I mean, it casts this very negative view on human nature, and that kind of cynicism is not going to help anybody with their mood or their sense of possibility, right? So there's such a lack of gratitude that, I mean, I think part of the benefit of learning of history is seeing how many problems we've solved. There's so many atrocious things that have happened before that are no longer problems. And that's, ironically, that's how we have the relatively safe, resourced, abundant lives that we have, and the freedom of speech that we have, and the access to resources that we have that allows us to throw these tantrums, right? I would encourage people to look at history with a different lens. Think about the helpers, think about the people who were courageous and genius and allowed us to have the technology and the resources that we have today, the people who fought in the civil rights movement, the people, there's just so much to be grateful for. And that doesn't mean that you're going to sit back and be lazy. It means, wow, I'm supported in my values and in my striving. I'm supported by so many people who've come before me, people I'm going to work alongside, people are going to come after me. And so what do I want to do with that support? What do I want to do with solving the problems that we've left to solve now, inspired by how people have solved problems in the past? What can I learn from them? Have some humility, have some gratitude, see who else is out there with you, look for the good guys. That's going to be good for your mental health, and it's going to empower you to think about where to direct your efforts to be effective and have a meaningful life.
Yeah. I love that, the focus on gratitude. I think it is so, so important. I know it helps me when I start feeling, crotchety or down about things. I try to snap myself out of it by looking at something. Sometimes I don't have to look far. I mean, I can just look around my own office, you know, and find something, pictures of my kids or something, and just be like, okay, life is good, right? Um, do you think it's possible that some of the things we've been talking about today are cultivating mental illness where it wasn't before in our
Mhm.
children?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there are these systems in the brain called the default mode network. Now, I'm a little bit of a neuroscience geek, but I don't remember things in detail. But I know that the default mode network is a network of regions of the brain that I mean, it's what it sounds like, right? It's kind of your brain's idling neutral position. So when you're driving a familiar route and that you can, your mind is wandering, or the thoughts that you're having in the shower, right? Um, anytime that you're awake, but you're not engaged in the task positive network where, you're really focused on what's happening in the moment. Like right now, I would say I'm in the task positive network. I'm very focused on this conversation. But after this, when I get in my car to drive to my appointment, I might go into my default mode a little bit more. Um, we know that depression and anxiety are associated with both more time spent in the default mode network, a harder time getting out of it, and more negative quality of thoughts in the default mode network. Or so someone who's uh, emotionally doing quite well, they snap out of default mode easily and into task positive network. They're curious, engaged, focused, in a flow state. And when they are in default mode, it might be more like mind-wandering daydreaming, like, "Oh, what am I gonna do for my cousin's birthday?" Or, just little innocuous things popping into your head or ideas that are inspiring in some way. If you're having those types of thoughts and you're present in your life most of the time, then, you're in pretty good mental health. Whereas if you're out at a party, but all you can think about is how you hate being around people and you're just kind of like staring at your thumbs and that's associated with more rumination, depression, anxiety. um, One of the features of the default mode network, one of its jobs really, is to kind of check yourself to make sure you're behaving right. So we know social anxiety, rumination, self-criticism is either it's either an accurate or inaccurate, maybe exaggerated, read on, just that kinda review of, like, "Was that the right thing to say?" And, "Was that a real smile, or was she just humoring me?" All that kinda stuff, it plays a role, just like shame plays a role because we wanna make sure that we're tending to our relationships and so it's natural to have some degree of worry or kind of self-reflection on that stuff. But you don't want to spend too much time hanging out there and you don't want your thoughts to be repetitive and negative and obsessive. Um you want to be able to just kind of quickly go over, "Oh, yeah, that was kind of an ill-timed joke and all right, well, next time I'm going to go out of my way to be extra nice or whatever and hopefully she still likes me." You know? So all of this like focus on self-examination and like, "Oh, how am I feeling? What do I think about that?" Like, it's encouraging the self-reflection that is the default mode network, and really most of us would be happier if we thought about ourselves less. Now, there are certain people who could do with more self-reflection, um, self-examination, and we all know who they are because they stand out, But in general, you're gonna be happier if you care a little bit less, and most importantly, if you're just interested in other people and in what's happening around you. Generally, like and here's a social skill for anyone who needs a little, social skills tips is like, if you're curious about other people without being weird or creepy or intrusive or, asking if you can watch them brush their teeth, like You know? Like, if you're just curious about other people are gonna like you most of the time, and the people who aren't gonna like you, like, they're probably not the kind of people you wanna be friends with anyway. Like, don't overthink it. Be curious about other people, be curious about life, be engaged in the world around you, see how you can help, create something. You're gonna be fine.
Right. Yeah. I feel sometimes like they've got it backwards in education right now. They're teaching kids to externalize their self esteem and their identity and to internalize the like the things that really like whether they know things, what knowledge is. Their knowledge is my feelings, right? My feelings are facts. Objective knowledge, I don't need to have that. I just need to have a feeling about a thing. So they've got it sort of backwards, when in fact, no, you don't need other people's approbation to feel good about yourself. I mean, I'm not saying it isn't a nice perk to have people praise you and say you did a good job, but it means more when you actually did something, right, to earn it. And we don't seem to be teaching that. We seem to be teaching you should get points for being a certain way, most of which you didn't have a say in. And then what you just described, sort of getting out of your head, being curious, looking around the world, finding something to learn or something to be grateful for or to feel joy about. I don't see that. I don't see the kids today in on any of the learning materials or the focus in education being on something as basic as joy. Like just
Mm.
life is or can be pretty awesome. Like I I just don't see that. I'm not saying there
Mhm.
aren't teachers out there who are bringing that to their classroom. I'm sure there are. There are always that, the minority of wonderful teachers who go into the classroom every day super excited to share something wonderful about the world with their students. But the trend
Mhm.
is the world is awful. The world's imperfections need to be focused on 24/7 because it's our duty to fix them. The people who came before didn't, and they're bad because of it. And now, little child who knows nothing, it is your job to fix it. But first, of course, if you are deeply flawed in these 17 ways, you have to fix yourself. I've asked adults sometimes to put themselves in the shoes of that kid. Would you want to do this? Like today, at your age, today, would you want to go into work and have somebody present the world to you like that? Even knowing everything that you know? Or would you
Mhm.
be like, I quit? Like, I'm out. I'm leaving. I don't need this.
The
They can't.
the world is a concept that we can't grasp any more
Right.
than we can grasp the concept of God. Of course, the world actually exists. God is up for debate depending on your worldview. But
Right.
the world, I mean, by world, do you mean the whole planet and all the life forms on it and everything that is happening? Because our mental filters are powerful. They're necessary to help, you know, take in only a digestible amount of information and not all the information, because if you were taking in all the information of everything happening all the time, you would not be able to function. So we have to see the world through filters. Part of good mental health is knowing what your filters are and choosing some filters that are supportive of your mental health. Um, how we interpret the world is one of those filters, right?
Mhm.
And whatever you want to believe about the world, you will find evidence. There are people who believe that the world is flat, right? And they find evidence. So if you're determined to believe something, you will absolutely find evidence and people who agree with you. And you'll become emotionally invested, and your sense of identity and self esteem, especially in this climate, will become invested in seeing the world that way and confirming your existing biases, right? So if you want to believe that the world is a horrible place, you'll find evidence. If you want to believe that the world is a beautiful, amazing, wonderful place where you're surrounded by support and resources, um, you can see that way too. But it leaves out the agency of the individual. The idea with promoting activism in children is that your agency has to be in reaction to something, and what you're reacting to is the filter that the adults present the world through, right? So the adults take in the whole world, they choose the parts they want to focus on and how to spin those parts. Then they present them
Mhm.
to the children and say, this is what the world is. And now you got to react to it in a certain way.
Right.
Part of the beauty of children is that they're new.
Yeah.
Like I mean, we're not blank slates, but children bring fresh perspectives. Children can create new things. And if anything, that's what we should be focused on doing, because you will never eradicate evil. And
Mhm.
chances are, if you try, you're going to be really frustrated and you might miscomprehend the nature of evil. That's the other thing, is that I think
Yep.
there's a lot of miscomprehension of the nature of evil and kind of barking up the wrong tree. Um, if Earth is somewhere between heaven and hell, which I think most people would agree that, if you're going to take a spiritual view, Earth is somewhere in the middle. Good and evil exist if you believe in either of them. Then, what makes you so special? What makes your group so special that for the first time in history, the world is going to become heaven because you managed to eradicate evil? No, that's not how it works. It's like you get to choose how much of your time and energy and focus you spend building the kind of world you want to live in or reacting to your take on the world not being the kind of world you want to live in, which again is hubristic and short-sighted. Um, I think the focus needs to be on creation, not on reaction.
Right. It seems destructive, in fact. And in some cases, they'll explicitly say we need to decolonize, we need to deconstruct, we need to destruct the things that came before, which of course we've heard in political rhetoric in the past, Mao and so forth. But what I'm concerned about is the way they're packaging it right now to sell to parents and even to kids, especially the older kids, like teenagers, as mental health, whether it's mental health awareness or it's mental health screening to prevent poor outcomes of either mental health. They're actually saying now through these screenings, they can prevent school shootings, which is interesting in that at least it's a nod towards an underlying cause that isn't the firearm. But you know what I'm saying? It's like they'll say we can prevent all things, we can control for all things, and you just can't. I don't think the human mind works that way. I don't think mental health works that way. And I like I said, I'm not a pro, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that if you look for a thing, you're going to find it. So if you're looking for mental health problems, you're going to find them,
Yeah.
whether you're looking to screen for them or you're looking to treat them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're spending an inordinate amount of time on that, and they're calling everything that gets criticized, well, it's for mental health, as if that's the new thing we're not allowed to criticize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
If it's
mean,
an
as a mental
initiative
health
tied to that.
professional, I'm
Yeah.
I'm kind of offended by this, except I'm not easily offended. I say that in jest, but
Right.
and by the way, like talk about mental health, like cultivating the ability to not be easily offended is a really good thing for your mental health. And that's another one of these problems is like be offended by everything. It, there is not a sound mental health professional who really knows their stuff who would honestly tell you that being offended by as many things as possible is good for your mental health. Like and how does it show that you have any emotional intelligence either? Like where's the emotional intelligence in outrage when you could, cultivate the ability to see things from multiple perspectives? I think I just got a little off track. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, well, so
And fix yourself. I'm sorry, you used the phrase "fix yourself" at some point, and I wrote it down because it's like, as a therapist, I could tell you, people come to me all the time like, "I gotta fix myself." It's like, well,
yeah.
what does that mean? Like, I'm not like an engineer, and you don't have like a
Right.
broken mechanical piece, right? Like, and there's so much. I mean, okay, look at the criteria for depression. Depression is characterized by a lack of pleasure, motivation, or interest. That's like the beginning of the definition of depression. Pleasure, motivation, and interest. Those are three positive things, right? And then if you expand on the definition, it's like low energy, low motivation, low sex drive, low self-esteem, all of that, right? Low, 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 low. So if it's a problem, what's the solution? The solution is pleasure, motivation, interest, self-esteem. Um, and so then how do you build those things, right? The focus, whether you're trying to treat depression or just live a good life, how do I enjoy my life? How do I become curious? How do I find the energy to do things that are meaningful to me? Like that's all you need.
Right.
But I can't remember what the question was. I feel like there was
Well,
more
no,
to it.
it's just, I'm saying that, everything you're saying is, I agree with. First of all, it's like, yes, yes, yes. Could you please go redesign the the criteria for the schools, because they're selling the polar opposite of what you're describing to parents and again, like to the kids when they have them sit and do these things, and calling it in support of mental health. We are mental health supports, they call it mental health focus, whatever they, however they brand it. So when people come and ask the questions I've been asking you, could it possibly be causing mental health problems? Is it possible the kids are, upset about something else? So they're constipated. That's why he has a funny look on his face today. Whatever. Somebody pointed out in the chat how there was a famous episode of, I think it was 3.5 Men or one of those things, where the kid, they're all worried about the kid, and it turned out the kid was constipated. But if you ask these questions, whether it's a school board meeting or you go ahead and you ask a professional, a teacher, it's, you want to undermine their efforts to address mental health concerns. And it's being used almost like a shield. Like, you can't criticize the way we're going about this, because as soon as I slap the label mental health on it, it's untouchable. It's like what they did with racism. If you criticize the way we're teaching history, you're a racist. Or
Yeah.
or we were teaching literature. Now you criticize the way we're doing social and emotional learning skills. We're no longer doing it in a remediation way with individuals, right? As you pointed out, go get the kid who looks like they need help. Now it's everybody. We're going to do lessons on social and emotional skills. And if you question or criticize that, mental health. So that's the new racism.
Yeah. And
and
as
I just don't know why mental health professionals, I mean, there's you obviously, but you're not in education, but there are school counselors, school psychologists, the Psychological Association of America, or whatever that is. And I'm just wondering why they aren't lighting their hair on fire and saying, this is not the way. This is not what our profession is about.
well, and let it be the purview of our profession and the domain of individual families to make decisions in terms of what kind of mental health supports their kids need. I think the word mental health is I don't think kids understand the word mental, first of all. It's way too abstract. Um, how about just trying to create a healthy environment? An environment that is healthy in terms of being positive and, supporting the health of the body. I think this also we're talking about a mind-body separation, which is another problem with, how kids are being brought up right now, is there's a lot of mind-body separation, right? Like, kids being constipated or having a stomach ache, that's the body showing up on their face, right? And similarly, sometimes kids are just tired or thirsty, and part of teaching emotional intelligence to them is helping them learn to recognize their own body's signals. That's part of how you become a healthy person. If you're trying to focus on someone's psychological needs without the physical needs, it can be a huge waste of time and energy. I mean, I can't tell you how many people can make drastic improvements in their mental health just through improving their nutrition, hydration,
Mm.
movement. The things that are good for the body are good for the mind. And that's actually a litmus test of truth, right? Because the body and mind are together. And I believe that if anything suggests that it's good for the mind, but it's destructive to the body, then that's a lie. And if anything suggests that it's good for the body, but it's destructive to the mind, then that's a lie. So an example, if there's a diet and exercise routine that's supposed to make you super fit, but it's so extreme that it makes you irritable with your family and you start withdrawing from people and snapping, like, that's not healthy overall. It's not sustainable, right? And similarly, that's one of my critiques of the whole trans thing, right? Is that I don't believe it's ever been necessary or beneficial to harm your body in the service of your mind. This is something that can be treated mentally without harming the body. So this mind body separation is not leading anyone anywhere good. And these people professing to be experts on mental health by hyper focusing on it rather than creating an environment that's actually just conducive to mental health. You don't have to be fixated on mental health to create an environment that's conducive to good mental health. And that's what they
Yeah.
should be focusing on. And learning from people, learning from the actual experts on mental health as consultants of how do you create healthy environments, socially healthy environments. And what they're doing, as we're talking about, is the opposite of that.
Yeah, they're focusing a lot on differences between people as opposed to common, common humanity,
Mhm.
focusing, which to me breaks down any of that compassion or empathy they claim to care so much about. If you really want to foster that, you focus on what you share, not how you're different. I mean, I think it's important
Right.
to learn about perspective, to have perspective that someone does maybe literally have a different experience than you have in their day to day or where they go home, as a matter of facts. Like you said, cognitively, not emotionally. You can't feel what they feel, but you can be more aware intellectually that they live in a different kind of dwelling, or they live on the other side of town where things are different or whatever. That's fine. But I think they're not doing that. Everything is emotional. And the final trend I wanted to ask you about, presentation of the feelings. Now, it's been my understanding as someone I've been to therapy in my past, of cognitive behavioral therapy, et cetera, that what I see happening is they're asking students to do a lot of documenting their trauma. So
Mm.
the first thing they do is they introduce the concept of trauma to students at a very young age, which concerns me. They're talking about things being trauma that I don't actually think are trauma. In other words, they've broadened the definition to things that are, like puberty, okay, or someone not wanting to be your friend anymore, or something like that. They're calling it trauma. And when I think of trauma, I think of, rape or divorce of your parents, or, a big move that suddenly had to happen. Somebody died, things like that. Natural disaster. And they're introducing it and almost making it seem like every single child in the room has experienced it. And then they're telling them to go ahead and document it, like write it in a journal, write stories about it, almost autobiographically chronicle your trauma. And it was my understanding that was a really bad thing to do. Is that true, or am I
Yeah, well, I mean,
misunderstanding?
let's pick that apart. So there's the documentation part, but there's also the redefinition of trauma, and then, oh my gosh, there's so much wrong with this. I mean, this is it's none of their business, right? Like you have a responsibility as a teacher to look out for signs of abuse and make a CPS report if there's actual abuse or neglect happening. Um, but no, you should not be framing ordinary stressors as traumas. Humans are anti-fragile. We require a certain amount of stress. The world has never been a perfectly safe place. Life is not meant to be heaven on earth. Like there's just a certain amount of challenge and hardship that comes with the territory of being alive. That's nothing new. In fact, we live in a relatively safe and prosperous time. Um, it's not good to frame everything like a trauma. There's a time and place for acknowledging that something was traumatic. And school's not it, and ordinary things are not it, right? Ordinary things need to be normalized. Kids need to be seen as stronger than those problems.
Mhm.
Um, and then the documenting and the sharing of it. So the invasiveness of the expectation to share it, that is also like grooming, right? So one of the key elements of something that's actually traumatic, which, like, a kid not wanting to be friends with you is not traumatic, right? But of something where you were truly unsafe and had no choice, is that your consent was taken away and you had to leave your body and dissociate because it wasn't safe to stay there and feel how scared and helpless you were. Um, so as someone who's a mental health professional that's treated trauma, one of the first things I do when I know that someone has a trauma history is say, you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to tell me. Just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean that you should magically be able to flip a switch in your brain where you trust me more than you've ever trusted anyone. Like, yeah, I'm qualified, but still, this is a human relationship. And you're not just going to naturally feel safe to share all this vulnerable stuff. You need to feel comfortable and ready. And this is about reclaiming your bodily autonomy. This is about reclaiming your sense of choice with what you share, when, where, with whom. And that's sometimes that's like the most validating and healing thing for someone to say, and or for someone to hear, right? And people who have experienced trauma, especially like early or complex trauma, in mental health care, and this is the domain of therapists, this is not the domain of teachers, They need, they need help getting back to a place where they can kind of feel their center, feel safe in their body, know where their boundaries are, have those boundaries, give them a fair amount of room. We don't want boundaries that are rigid. We want boundaries that are, flexible and permeable, but where you can kind of make yourself comfortable and know that you don't have to expose anything you don't want to expose. Nobody's entitled to anything that you don't want to share with them. That you can make yourself comfortable. You can get familiar with people. You can make small talk. And if something makes you uncomfortable, you can be like, I don't want to talk about that. That's too personal. I don't know you that well, right? So boundaries are a really important part of trauma recovery. And encouraging people outside of a therapeutic context, outside of a context where they've sought or consented to this, encouraging them to open up about it without the right help and without it being on their own terms is, in fact, re-traumatizing. And writing, I mean, I say this as a writer. I love writing. Writing's great for mental health. Um, there's a time and place for writing out your traumas, but it's probably not when you're a kid, and it's probably not when you're alone with nobody there to, hold your hand through the process, literally or figuratively. Um, Part of recovering from trauma and part of just becoming an emotionally sound, resilient human being is the knowing how to process things. And we need help learning how to process things. Writing in and of itself, if you don't have the other skills or resources in place, can just be another form of rumination. Um, and so writing can be a supportive process in the right way, time, and place where,
Mhm.
sometimes you need a little bit of guidance to be able to contextualize, right? To be able to create a narrative that makes sense and meaning of things, that helps you get to peace with things, that helps you get to the point where that happened then, it's not happening now, it wasn't my fault. And now I know that I'm going to protect myself moving forward in this way. And now I have these people on my side. Like, that's an important part of the process. And I don't think that anyone should be inflicting that on children. I think that if school is for learning academically, then let kids practice their writing and critical thinking skills with things that aren't going to be so emotionally upsetting for them
Right. That's
or so
why, like I said, I
personal.
like having them write about other people's life, write about literature, write about something that's at a more emotional distance because they can still learn a lot about themselves. It's just more subtle and it's at a safer distance. It's not something where we're asking them to process ahead of where they're capable in that emotional sense.
Yeah.
And when all of this is taking place, and I know I said that was my last question, but this really is my last question because I know you have a hard stop. But when all of this that we just discussed about the trauma and, sharing is occurring in an environment where there's a literal hierarchical difference between the child and the adult asking them to do it in a sense that that person's going to be evaluating them, maybe giving them a grade. So it's not a therapist. The
Right.
one thing when you go to the therapist is there's, like you said, the stakes are, you're paying for it, but you're not going to be graded on how well you did
Oh,
today at
yeah.
therapy. So I can't help but feel like that automatically, no matter what else is going on in an environment, in a school, that hierarchical relationship sets up a dynamic. Then you have to start with understanding and appreciation for that because children are very, like any other creature that understands innately that it's in a subservient position, whether physically, emotionally, or, kind of legally, whatever, they will behave differently. They perceive everything differently than when they're not in that type of an environment. Am I correct in saying that?
You've brought up such a good point. I mean, it's funny that the people who are doing this are really obsessed with the idea of power in terms of like power and privilege and all that, but totally blind to the power in that relationship. Part of being trained as a relational psychodynamic therapist is that you're aware of the power dynamics in the room. And I have grown adults who haven't been in school for years, who have good heads on their shoulders. They know what therapy is. And they still sometimes feel like they're being graded on this, And a good therapist with, I think a relational psychodynamic foundation really helps with this. is going to be aware of the fact that our clients might be trying to please us. They might be trying to do therapy right, and you should be able to pick up on that as a therapist. I said to a client um, who I could tell they had some perfectionistic and people pleasing tendencies, and I said, I have a sort of quote unquote homework. I have some resources that I think you might be interested in outside of session, but I want to be really careful about how I suggest that to you because the last thing I want is for you to feel like, oh, I better get that thing done because I'm seeing my therapist on Friday and I don't want to disappoint her. Like that's not what this is about at all. Right. So the teacher student relationship, the parent child relationship, all these relationships can show up in therapy and affect how people engage in therapy. And therapy is a place that's meant for that, right? So if that can happen for adults, then what does that say about the power dynamic where someone this is their teacher. They are the adult in the adult child relationship. They do give grades, right? And those grades get taken home and become maybe part of how their parents discipline them and how other kids treat them. Of course, that's a huge power dynamic. And of course, the kid's going to want to say the right thing, not necessarily the accurate or true thing, but the thing that they think the teacher is looking to hear.
Right. Or that the other students around them, because they're now everything's done as a group and they hear everything. There's no sense of privacy anymore.
You should never feel like you're being graded on how you feel. Like,
Right.
that's not
Right.
a thing.
Exactly. I cannot thank you enough. This was absolutely fascinating and really, really helpful. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It was sort of a little bit validating that some of the things I'd already thought, even as a layperson, were like, okay, I wasn't completely off base there when I said this or thought that. But you've added so much depth to the conversation and so much understanding in terms of the clinical side of things and just straight up common sense too. I think it's really important for the audience to hear, especially parents, that somebody who's not involved in education, this sounds just wrong. So if you're out there, parents, and you're thinking like, this doesn't feel right to me, but they're telling me it's right. Okay, well, here is one point of view anyway from a clinician who says, no, this is not right. So for what that's worth, I hope you will feel empowered to protect your own child and to ask good questions and maybe even bring some of this knowledge that you've gained today to bear in your fight for your own kids. So Stephanie, thank you. Thank you so very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you to everyone who came. Please, again, consider liking, sharing, subscribing to the broadcast, and please also subscribe to Stephanie's podcast. This will be now the podcast itself. Is it Some Therapist, or does it have a different? It's
The podcast is You Must Be Some
You
Kind of
Must Be Some
Therapist.
Kind of Therapist, right? And then you can follow her at Some Therapist, right?
Thank you
On
so much,
Twitter
Deb.
and Instagram.
I'm really
Thank
glad we
you.
did this. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, likewise. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
All right, bye.